Hi, I'm Jonathan Small from Global Ag Risk Solutions. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about fixed costs and why they're important and how to manage them. So if you've watched my other video about gross margin, you'll understand what goes into the gross margin and why it's important. But in order to make money from farming, I need to obey one very simple rule, which is I need more gross margin than I have fixed costs. If I can maximize my gross margin and minimize my fixed costs, I'll make a profit. So what's included in your fixed costs? Well, it's basically everything but those production costs. In other words, it's everything but seed, fertilizer, and chemical on a grain farm. The reality is that fixed costs are not nearly as fixed as the title would suggest. They do change, you can manage them, and how you manage them makes a difference. They tend to change more slowly, but they can certainly change. To keep it simple though, we like to put them into two very broad categories. We have the labor, power, machinery costs, the cost of getting the job done on the farm, and then we have the land building and finance costs, which are really the result of whether you're effective at managing the gross margin and the labor, power, and machinery costs, and also your decisions about farm growth and expansion and reinvestment and so on. We're going to focus mostly in this video on the labor, power, and machinery costs, because if you can get this right and you can get the gross margin right, the land building and finance costs will follow along just nicely. So within the labor, power, and machinery costs, we have four major components that really decide whether you're going to succeed or whether you're not in managing this category. Depreciation of equipment and rental of equipment, they really substitute for each other. Fuel costs, repairs on that plant and equipment, repairs and maintenance on that plant and equipment, and of course the labor costs. You can't get good labor, power, and machinery costs without being good at these four. I'm going to give you three rules which will help you to understand and manage this category more effectively. I'm going to talk about the equipment ratio, which is a term you may have come across already. We're going to talk about the 60% rule and the 25% rule. The fact is that you use all three of these together. They're all interconnected, and fundamentally the one that underpins the whole lot is the equipment ratio. If you're good at managing that and you can keep that at an efficient level, you're going to fall in line with the 60% rule and the 25% rule. So, equipment ratio, that's the fair market value of every piece of field equipment on your farm expressed per seeded acre on your farm. It's a simple number, it's a very simple ratio, it's easy to benchmark. What you need to do is know what your equipment ratio is now, so measure it, be realistic about those fair market values. Don't worry about whether it's financed or leased and so on, just what's its value today on the market. You also need to know where it's heading. Is it heading up? Is it heading down? You need to be constantly looking at that. I would suggest at least on a 5-year time horizon, perhaps longer, and that's a rolling time horizon. So at any one point in time, you ought to have a pretty clear view about what's the value of your equipment line, and then you need to manage it. And part of managing it is going to be having a plan for it, what's affordable on your farm, and the 60% rule and the 25% rule are going to guide you on that. So the 60% rule basically says this, that 60% of your total fixed costs reside in the labor, power, and machinery costs, which underlines the importance of managing this one really effectively. So if you have complete control over your labor, power, and machinery costs, which really means that you have complete control over your equipment ratio, then you've got control over 60% of your overheads. And effectively, that means that you've got control over the other 40%, because it's largely a product. The land building and finance is largely a product of your effectiveness at getting good gross margins, protecting those gross margins, and managing your plant and equipment. The 25% rule says this, is that every dollar that you have invested in equipment ratio turns into 25 cents of expenses somewhere on your farm. You might wonder, well, how do we get to that? Well, depreciation makes up a big part of that. Depreciation on equipment, and you better believe that it's real, because it is. It might appear in your statements as a non-cash cost, but it turns into cash every time you upgrade or trade out equipment. Depreciation typically runs, a good rule of thumb, 15 to 20% a year on all of your equipment. Then we have repairs, and believe it or not, study after study has shown that repairs run at roughly 5% of that equipment ratio. So double your equipment ratio, generally you're going to double your repair costs. And there's a range there but 5% is pretty much where it's at. Some people are high, some people are low. 5% is a good rule of thumb. And last but not least, of course, is the cost of the money itself that's tied up in that equipment. And you might say, well, my equipment's not financed, so there's no cost associated with the money that's tied up. But remember, there's opportunity cost. If you've got an extra $1 million tied up in equipment that maybe you don't really need, what else could you own with that $1 million? You could have more working capital, or you could just own more land. And we know how land performs, especially compared with equipment. So it's either a real finance cost on that equipment, or it's a real opportunity cost that there's something else that you can't do, and that's often higher than the finance cost. So it really does have a very long-term effect, and that's why we talk about you needing to plan and budget your equipment ratio in a 5 to 10 year time frame, because it literally charts your course down this path. So let's just recap here before we finish this video. If you're going to manage your fixed costs, what I've been saying is, well, then you need to fundamentally get a grip and manage your labor, power, machinery costs. And you do that by doing one thing, and this is really simple, which is manage that equipment ratio. And everything else will follow along very nicely.